considering the level of conversation and the enthusiasm, I think we can already call this symposium a success. For those of you who don't know me, my name is James Fraser. I have the distinct pleasure of serving as the acting director for the School of Policy Studies here at Queen's University. I also serve as Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Science in the grad portfolio. I want to welcome you to this symposium celebrating Tom Courchene and his many contributions to public policy in Canada. I want to particularly extend a special word of welcome to Margie Courchene, many children, grandchildren, and friends who are able to be here. It's so wonderful that you could come today. Thank you so much. On that note, also, I want to mention and recognize that this symposium is being supported by the Margie and Tom Courchene Endowment Fund, which was established through the generous donations by the family and friends. Kudos have to go out also to Keith Banting, to Bronwyn, and to Carrie for all their tireless work in planning this symposium and pulling it off so well. At this point, I just want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people. It's been an incredible privilege to live, to work, to have raised my family on these lands and on these waterways. Land acknowledgements are, of course, a chance to reflect on the past, but I'd also invite you to think about the future. And a specific future that I want to share with you is that in 2 weeks, in this very, very room, we'll have a celebratory feast for graduates, Indigenous graduates of our STEM Indigenous Academics program. And they will come together as that community that they built 4 years ago, way back when they were starting their undergraduate adventures here at Queen's. They make our community so much more rich. That program is actually a program jointly offered by the Faculty of Health Sciences, Smith Engineering, and the Faculty of Arts and Science. So on that point, I would like to cede the podium to my boss, Interim Dean Bob Lemieux.
Thanks, James, and good morning, everyone. On November 4th, we lost one of Canada's most influential economists. Tom Courchene was a remarkably creative thinker who devoted his career to sparking debates over public policy in Canada. Tom continually challenged conventional thinking about the leading economic and social issues of the day, and his own ideas continually evolved, taking him into new and inventive directions. Today we're gathered to celebrate Tom's life, his legacy, his service to Canada, and to Queen's University. In addition to his role as a public intellectual, Tom served as the founding director of our School of Policy Studies, and he was the inaugural Stauffer Dunning Chair in Public Policy. After completing his term as director of SBS, Tom took on the Jaroslawski Deutsch Chair in Economic and Financial Policy, and he served at various times as director of the Institute for Intergovernmental Relations and the John Deutsch Institute in the Department of Economics. In many ways, Tom represented the continuation of a long tradition of engagement in public policy debates at Queen's University. This tradition can be traced back to the university's earliest days. Principal George Grant was a principal in the late 19th century, whose name, of course, graced our clock tower. He was a leading public intellectual of his time. He crisscrossed the country debating the policy issues of the day. This tradition was carried forward in the 20th century by faculty members such as Adam Short and O.D. Skelton, who helped build a modern public service, especially at the federal level. In 1988, this commitment to public policy led to the establishment of the School of Policy Studies and the successful effort to recruit Tom Courchene to come to Queen's and serve as the first director of SBS. The school has a dual mandate: to deliver the Master of Public Administration program, training a new generation of policy leaders for tomorrow, and to serve as a hub, linking the world of research with that of public policy. Traditionally, the school helped energize and integrate research and related social science disciplines, such as economics, political studies, and law. And going forward, our hope is to extend this mission to the university as a whole. Today's symposium celebrates the contribution of Tom Courchene. He was an officer of the Order of Canada, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a recipient of the Canada Council Molson Prize for Lifetime Achievement, and a winner of the Donner Prize twice. Our task today is to understand the characteristics that made him so successful and to draw lessons from the challenges that are facing us today. And boy, do we have many challenges. On a final note, I'd like to recognize the role of Eugene Lang in re-energizing the school during his tenure as acting director. This past year has seen a remarkable program of weekly speakers, bringing leading policymakers and commentators to the school and enriching our collective understanding of the challenges facing contemporary governance. Gene also attracted new talent to the school, including Bob Ray as a Matthews Fellow in Global Public Policy. And Gene has worked with the school's advisory council, and he's provided great leadership to the MPA program. Thank you, Gene. And now it's my pleasure to invite Keith Banting to the podium.
So thank you, Bob and James. And I'd like to add my personal word of welcome to everyone here. There are so many familiar faces, old friends, new friends of the school. Thank you all for coming. It's a remarkable testament. The turnout is a remarkable testament to Tom and to the wonderful things that the ways in which he lit up our days when we worked together. Is this working? Can you all hear me? Okay. So, as been emphasized, Tom made remarkable contributions to a wide range of economic policy in Canada. He was known for his work on monetary policy, financial institutions, economic regionalism, equalization, fiscal federalism, and social policy. In addition, Tom tackled some issues that are particularly sensitive, including the place of Indigenous people in Canada. In designing today's sessions, we have asked our speakers on two panels to address two questions. Simple questions, but probably the answers are complex. The first question was, why was Tom such an effective contributor to public debates? What was it that was special or distinctive about Tom's approach to being an academic in Canada in that era? Why was he so successful? He tackled a wide range of policy issues. Was that it? He had multidisciplinary instincts. Maybe that was part of it. He was fearless in pushing policy issues that went beyond the boundaries of contemporary debate at the time. The French artist Henri Matisse once said that creativity requires courage. Well, Tom had courage in spades, and I think he was always happiest when his work was just on the edge of the world of policy as it was unfolding at the time. But what else was involved? His uncanny ability to anticipate issues over the horizon? That's one of our questions we have posed. Why was Tom so effective? A second question we have asked our speakers to address is perhaps a little more complex. Does Tom's approach to public policy remain relevant today? Tom saw himself as what he called a market populist, combining a reliance on markets with a commitment to protecting the vulnerable, those displaced by economic change. Presumably, such a combination would seem relevant in any age. But we obviously live today in a different place. Tom was a man of his age. His world, as I understand it, was worked on the assumption of globalization and deep integration with the American economy. He once used the phrase TINA. Pardon this personal indulgence. So the phrase TINA, T-I-N-A, developed in Britain when Margaret Thatcher was pursuing her very strong economic agenda and defended her position as saying, there is no alternative. People in the British journalists started to call her Tina. There is no alternative. Tom, in one of his presentations, I'll never forget, took the phrase Tina and then said, in Canada it meant trapped in North America. Okay? So that was the world that Tom saw. We now live in a world where the Prime Minister tells us there's been a major rupture in the geopolitical and geoeconomic context. And so one has to ask, what is the position of a market populist today? Are we in a world which is less reliant on markets and more dependent on state leadership? Or are we in a world where the same kind of magical combinations that Tom worked can also continue here and now? So these are two simple questions. And to answer them, we have put together, I think, a remarkable set of panels, two panels, each with three people. So I will be your moderator for the first panel, and Jennifer Ditchburn, president of IRPP, will be moderating the second panel. So for the first panel, I'd like to introduce our three panelists briefly. The details of their bios are in the pamphlets that we handed out that you should have gotten as you came in, and so I will be very general in my observations. First, Robin Boadway. Robin is the David Chadwick Smith Emeritus Professor of Economics. His career in economics was based at Queen's University, and he has had a remarkable career, past president of the Canadian Economics Association, a distinguished fellow at the University of Munich, an honorary degree recipient at a number of universities, and his research has focused on public economics in the main, public policy, intergovernmental relations, fiscal federalism, and redistribution. And he has a number of recent books articulating the key concepts in these areas, and I'll leave you to track through the actual titles. Our second speaker is Kevin Lynch. And in each of the panels, I should say, we tried to combine a Queen's scholar who has worked with Tom and knows his work well, with a policy practitioner who has seen Tom from on the receiving side, if you will, and then another person who I call a younger generation, but Lisa Powell thinks that's a little, well, I'll explain in a moment. So, first, sorry, I'm making a hash of this. First, Robin, and then Kevin Lynch is our second speaker, hailing from Cape Breton. The Honorable Kevin Lynch has been a leader in public policy and in the private economy throughout his career. A distinguished former federal public servant, Kevin was the 20th Clerk of the Privy Council, Secretary of the Cabinet, and Head of the Public Service of Canada. His government career also included Deputy Minister of Finance, Deputy Minister of Industry, and Executive Director for Canada at the International Monetary Fund. Following his government service, he's been very active in the private economy, including as Vice Chairman of BMO. I would also notice that he is a recent co-author of a book trying to make sense and to help reform the structure of government in Canada, And we recently had a launch event here at Queen's for a book he co-authored, A New Blueprint for Government Reshaping Power, the PMO, and the Public Service, which which advances a pretty, I would say, radical transformation of government in Canada. Dr. Lynch is a member of the Queen's Privy Council, Officer of the Order of Canada, and has received 11 honorary degrees. That's a bit greedy, Kevin. Well, maybe Queens will step up. Our second speaker is Kevin Lynch. Finally, our third speaker is Lisa Powell. Lisa Powell is Distinguished Professor in the Division of Health Policy Administration and Director of Policy Practice and Prevention Research Center at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She does work on the relationship between food and diet and human behavior and the outcomes that people have in terms of health. She is a major mogul in the world of finance in these areas. She is the manager of major gifts, major contributions from the Bloomberg Foundation. We were chatting yesterday, and she says that she's one of the very few of her colleagues who actually has a research grant, a massive research grant that hasn't been pulled back because it's from the Bloomberg Foundation. Lisa has had a remarkable career, but that's not exclusively why she's here. Lisa was one of Tom's students. He was one of her advisors during her PhD, and during her years when she taught at the School of Policy Studies. She taught economics for about 6 years here, and we were very sad to see her go. And in a sense, Tom was one of her mentors. Academics can have influence through their research in several ways. One is to publish work and try and shape debate that way. And another way academics have research is through their doctoral students, whose ideas they sometimes influence and who become another generation shaped by the work and the guidance of a faculty member. So Lisa is, in a sense, one of those people, and I think you'll see that reflected in her remarks. So thank you very much, and we will start with Robin.
Thank you, Keith. I'm one of the old faces he referred to. I'm very flattered to be given this opportunity to offer some celebratory remarks on Tom Courchene's massive contribution to Canadian economic policy. Like everyone, I very much admired his originality and policy insights and learned a lot from him. He was really one-of-a-kind scholar whose ideas influenced economic policy debates in Canada for over 5 decades. He put an unending sequence of unimaginable ideas on the table, and it was quite awesome to watch and absorb. In preparing my remarks, I wanted to try and figure out what drove Tom's ideas. What were the basic principles that he followed? I'm going to try and distill what I thought that was. You may disagree with me. I actually went back and perused as many of Tom's writings as I could. This was a tough but rewarding way of spending an old-fashioned Canadian winter, or a Saskatchewan winter as Tom would have remembered it. Doing so reminded me that Tom wrote faster than I could read, just like he spoke more rapidly than I could comprehend. And if you ever went to one of his talks, he put more information on his slides than you could possibly absorb. That is, he had a lot to say and he wanted to get it out. The breadth and originality of his work is quite stunning, but what I learned from reading it was that as diverse as it was, his underlying methodology was, I think, quite consistent and in many ways suited to the time. So let me talk about Tom's approach to policy. I don't know if I'm going to be exactly hitting on the two questions that Keith posed, but let's see. His characteristics as a policy scholar were well captured in the introduction to the conference volume published in his honor, entitled Thinking Outside the Box, aptly. The editors, Keith Banting, Rick Tchaikovsky, and Steve Lair, characterized Tom as a public intellectual whose approach was multidisciplinary, accessible, and outside the box, all of which are true. His work spanned a wide range of areas, including regional economics, international economics, monetary economics, macroeconomics, fiscal federalism, environmental economics, social economic policy, human capital growth, et cetera, et cetera. But in all these areas, I think his approach was quite consistent. As Keith mentioned, Tom referred to himself as a market populist. But I think that does him a disservice. He was firmly market-oriented, but he was no populist, at least in the sense in which the term has come to mean nowadays. He didn't cater to any particular group and had no particular urge for public acceptance of his ideas, some of which were pushed back on. I would say instead that he was a market liberal in the small L sense, the classical small L sense. He put the interests of individuals at the center of his policy prescriptions. His default position was to decentralize policymaking to the lowest level feasible or efficient, starting from the individual, then the city, the province or territory, the First Nation, finally the federal government, and possibly to constrain higher level decision makers. This corresponds with what we have come to call the principle of subsidiarity, codified in the European Union. He applied this principle flexibly. Lower level decision makers could delegate their responsibilities upwards, and they could do so individually, selectively, leading to an asymmetric outcome. His implicit preference was for as little as possible overlap in responsibilities. This approach inevitably led to challenging the status quo in many areas, and doing so in ways that would have, in the political sphere, required some constitutional amendment. But that did not deter Tom. He was also, I think, very much an idealist. But there are many examples of this decentralized approach to policymaking. Let me mention a few examples in no particular sequence. An early controversy involving Tom was his claim that regional transfers, unemployment insurance and the like, led to something he called transfer dependency that discouraged out migration from particularly the Atlantic provinces and stunted their development. He argued that policy should be people-based and not place-based, and he emphasized the role of markets rather than governments in addressing regional inequalities. No need to say that there was some pushback to these ideas from the maritime provinces. Related to this, Tom argued that redistribution and social policies were often more effective the more responsibility was given to individuals for their own well-being. For example, creating equality of opportunity would encourage individuals to better prepare themselves for the information and technology age that he saw coming by investing in human capital, contributing to what he called a state of minds, one of his typical plays on words. He argued controversial for human capital investment as a superior alternative to income redistribution. He viewed social policy as a component of economic policy whose role included developing human skills and capital to prepare for the new world of information and technology. Apart from advocating equality of opportunity for individuals to exploit, Tom paid relatively little attention to redistributive policy. One exception was his advocacy of a negative income tax, what we now call a basic income, which he viewed as being the least intrusive and the most effective redistributive policy on offer. His views on subsidiarity were especially pronounced in matters of government responsibility. He advocated decentralizing as much responsibility to the provinces as was feasible and efficient. This included social policy, unfettered by the federal spending power. The ability of provinces to opt out with compensation from federal shared cost programs. Financial regulation by the provinces rather than by the federal government. Increased provincial revenue-raising responsibilities and a separate provincial income tax. And active provincial fiscal stabilization policies. If this led to fiscal competition, all the better, since this would result in experimentation, flexibility, accountability, and efficiency. If the provinces wished to defer to the federal government in any policy areas, that was their decision. That should be their decision. Alternatively, cooperative arrangements among the provinces, that is, a confederal relationship, might be better than federal involvement in provincial policy areas. Tom's preferences for decentralized decision-making was partly a matter of preference, but also partly driven by global forces that reduced the potency of the federal government. Who can forget the hybrid term glocalization used to describe how globalization rendered the federal government impotent and enhanced local policymaking? Tom accepted federal authority where necessary, but preferred to limit federal discretion. He accepted the need for equalization, famously calling it the glue that binds the nation together. A description that stuck, if you'll forgive the pun. But he advocated circumscribed federal discretion. Equalization should be formula-driven and should not creep into other federal programs. Equalization should include not just revenue capacity equalization, but also needs and costs of public services. The stance explicitly taken to benefit Ontario, or to treat them fairly, as he would say. Provinces would have a role to play. Resource revenues would be subject to a separate self-financing scheme operated by the provinces alone. The idea being that the federal government did not have direct access to resource revenues, so the sensible way to redistribute them was to rely on the provinces themselves who did have access to those revenues. Tom was also concerned with aspects of industrial policy. He encouraged provinces to save their resource revenues in a sovereign wealth fund, both to shield resource-dependent provinces from uncertain prices and also to shield non-resource industries from the so-called Dutch disease. This concern with the Dutch disease was expressed long before it became a matter of broader academic interest. Tom recognized the possible adverse consequences of heavy Canadian reliance on resource industries and the need for addressing the challenges imposed by information, technology, and competition. But this did not seem to translate into a role for an interventionist industrial policy for the federal government. Again, the preference for a people versus a place approach and for markets prevailed. Controversially, Tom recommended a North American monetary union, reducing federal discretion over exchange rate policy. This was contested by the economics profession, by some in the economics profession, but it was informed by the work of another famous Canadian economist, Robert Mundell, who won the Nobel Memorial Prize, partly for his work on optimal currency areas, and who incidentally lived in Kingston for a number of years. It was complementary to Tom's support for an unfettered internal economic union. The culmination of his decentralized views was to imagine Canada, reconstituted as a community of the Canadas, with 5 regional jurisdictions, including a First Nations province, an idea that had been earlier explored in work with Lisa Powell. These would replace the provinces. Their powers would be concurrent with the federal government, but paramount, and they could choose to pass selected powers upwards to the federal government in an asymmetric way. This would indeed be unlike anything anywhere else in the world. By definition, this was thinking outside of the box. More recently, Tom, together with John Allen, who's here, proposed a federal carbon tax whose design mimicked the goods and services tax, the GST. This was somewhat of a departure from the principle of subsidiarity, although it was the culmination of a sequence of provincially initiated carbon pricing regimes. It recognized the importance of national standards in climate policy. So, what is the relevance of Tom's approach today? This market, what I've referred to as market liberalism. His market liberalism and decentralizing approach certainly suited the times, when, as he observed, some of the follies of the centralized Canada were evident. But the times have changed. And the question is, how would Tom address the key issues facing Canada now? Would market liberalism provide the policy answers? And how much must we turn to the power of the federal government to address them? The policy issues facing Canada today are qualitatively different than they were even a decade ago. They're generational, they're nationwide, and they require the collaboration of both federal and provincial governments. To remind you of some key examples of the issues facing us: lagging productivity and the need to revitalize innovative, high-tech, and research-intensive industries, something that's been stressed by Kevin. Industrial and infrastructure policy to influence the balance among natural resource industries, manufacturing, services, and information, and to adjust to the changing trade and security environment. Internal common market and efficiencies, especially the mobility of professional labor, energy, communications, and services. The climate crisis. This is an interesting case, since, like Medicare, the provinces were the first to enact carbon pricing. It's an extremely challenging case, since controlling emissions is subject to what economists would call a double free rider problem. Free riding on the rest of the world, and free riding on future generations. Dealing with the climate crisis is the ultimate test of market liberalism. Wealth and income inequality, and tax policy to deal with it, particularly the concentration of wealth and equity income at the top, combined with poverty at the bottom and a very unequal pattern of inheritances. The ongoing Indigenous reconciliation project, to which Tom paid special attention. Movements for provincial autonomy, I'll use the word, partly influenced by a highly decentralized federation. Various labor issues, demographic trends, immigration, human capital investment, and training. And finally, fiscal sustainability and vertical balance in the federation. Addressing these policy issues is challenging. They involve matters of national concern, but they span responsibilities of both federal and provincial territorial jurisdictions and involve the interests of the First Nations. Arguably, they will lead to government intervention on a scale that we have not seen for some time, and they seem to call for collaboration rather than competition among governments, and for some re-centralization of economic policy. I would love to hear how Tom would have addressed them. no doubt we would be both surprised and enlightened by where his outside the box thinking would take him. Thank you.
Take advantage of the moment to come in and grab a seat.
You may need a coffee for my presentation, so I really would warn you in advance. Look, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate at the symposium celebrating Tom Courchene today. And there is a lot to celebrate. I think it's really timely, and Robin, thank you for the introduction. Keith and Robin, unlike others here today, just to be honest, I'm at best a lapsed economist, and I'm definitely not a Courchene scholar, as I will prove as I continue to talk, so bear with me. But over many years of public policy issues that motivated Tom to write and challenge the way things were in public policy, I was amongst those at the receiving end of Tom's advice. So Robin spoke about the production end here, and the stimulus, I was at the other end of it. So whether, in my case, at Industry Canada when Tom was criticizing regional policies, or at the Department of Finance when Tom was sharing his ideas on, and the list is long, exchange rates, inflation targeting, federal transfers, equalization, human capital, securities, and what have you, or at the Privy Council office when Tom was expressing his opinions about fiscal federalism and budgets, suffice to say that I ran into Tom's advice a lot. And, you know, indeed and it truly is an amazing range of topics that Tom dealt with. Tom, and you know, I was thinking back to this, Tom was the impetus for many, many memos to ministers and to the Prime Minister, answering the question, what is Courchene on about, and does he have a point? And you can't ask for a much better contribution than having policymakers asking that about your views. The answer was that Tom always had a point, and one worth considering, whether in the end you agreed with it or not. Or, as a senior public servant once put it, when we were talking about Tom, quote, Tom was not always right, but not always wrong, always worth reading, and never disrespectful. And it's not a bad tribute for anyone who's engaged in the political economy world. Not many people would say that about most in that world. We were asked today to reflect on two things. One, what was it about Tom's work that made him an effective contributor to public policy debates? And secondly, whether his approach to public policy remains relevant. And I think they're both really excellent questions. I'm probably going to focus a little bit more on the second because I knew that my colleague and first speaker would go on about his policy contributions. First, and others have used this term, Tom was a public intellectual in the very best sense of the term. He was attuned to real-world problems and how economics, his profession of choice, could help solve them. And solving problems, I think, is what, as a public servant, reading and hearing him, he was always trying to solve a problem, which is not the same as what a certain amount of academic endeavor tries to do. He understood better than many academics that to influence policy, you not only had to have really well analyzed argumentation, research, but you had to communicate it and do so in an accessible way. So if there are two takeaways, and I think they're relevant for the profession today, and I'll come back, is communication, communication, communication. I think, you know, academics in general, and I'll come back to the economics profession, aren't communicating. And aren't communicating generally and in an accessible way, the way Tom did in his time here. And I think it was. He also understood that repetition was not something to be scorned. He clearly enjoyed, it was interesting, he went through the range of them, he enjoyed tilting at the windmills of policy status quo. With analyses and policy prescriptions, I thought it was really neat. They were a unique mixture of multidisciplinary thinking. He was way ahead of his time in terms of merging disciplines. He had a mastery of institutional detail. Anybody who describes the equalization program as one of his favorite areas of research has to love institutional detail. There are about 4.5 people in Canada that actually understand it. He really was great at clear writing, and he enjoyed occasional heresy. And those different characteristics, I think, brought his policy writing and policy recommendations alive. From my various perches in government, and more so in hindsight, thinking back and around in the recent years, Tom's insightful identification of problems with how policies operated in practice and how their designs at times were in tension with the dynamics of the real world. In many ways, I think his identification of problems with policy were probably his biggest and most unique contribution. Much debate about whether the solutions were right or not, but a lot of wisdom learned from the diagnostic. Well, policymakers have not always agreed with his policy solutions, and I would be one of those. And you can talk about inflation targeting, exchange rates, aspects of fiscal federalism, and fragmented securities regulators spring to mind since I set up 4 separate task forces for a single Canadian securities regulator. There are lots of areas where there was a disagreement, but there was always attention paid to Tom's diagnostic. And I think that's the key. And you don't necessarily, for those students here thinking about careers in public policy, the key is not necessarily that your solution is the right one, but your analysis of the problem is taken seriously and changes people's perspectives. And I think Tom certainly was successful in that regard. Tom's perspectives on the moral hazard risks of government regional programs, and I come from Cape Breton, but actually left the Maritimes, notwithstanding the terrible programs that Tom talked about, did influence changes to the EI program and regional policies, and his critiques of equalization really led to the O'Brien report, which I was involved in setting up, and actually led to major changes, which Minister Flaherty brought in. And you could see Tom's fingerprints all over those changes, both to shared cost programs and to the equalization, and they were brought in 2009. My second reflection was that Tom was part of a generation of largely macroeconomists who engaged directly in attempting to shape public policy. Besides Tom, there was Doug Purvis, again from here, David Laidler, John Hellawell, and others. And all of their voices were heard frequently in the corridors of government and in the business pages of our national newspapers. And I think there was a strength and an impact because it wasn't a single voice. It was a multiplicity of voices dealing with issues. The group addressed issues that were top of the public's minds at those times. So again, they picked topics that were relevant for the day, and they still are. How to make the Federation work better, inflation, competitiveness, the shock of the FTA, fiscal crisis, lagging innovation and productivity. So they were tackling issues that mattered to the general public, and that's certainly what Tom did. There was also added influence in numbers. Economists were listened to in the big economic issues of the day. There was receptivity in government for outside thinking in Tom's years. And how do you handle some of these intractable problems? In many ways, I would argue that economists would describe it as a well-functioning market for policy ideas with high quality supply from Tom and others, and a clear demand function from policy advisors in government for the ideas, which is about as good as you can get, where you've got good supply and you've got demand. One without the other doesn't quite work. A third reflection is that timing matters. The era of politics in which communications trumps policy in a social media intensive world had not yet arrived when Tom was engaging governments and policymakers. Policy by polling and politics by messaging is a very different kind of public policy environment that the one that Tom operated in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. And I think it's, you know, it's a challenging one to think about how you do that, and I'll come back to it. Another difference, I think, to recent years and when Tom was advising was during Tom's years, the federal government had a fair degree of policy capacity in the federal public service, and public servants that were actually unleashed to actually try and understand and provide advice on the big policy issues of the day. And to do that, they actually reached out to people like Tom and others. And so you had an internal market, which was stimulated by their political masters to what in the heck do we do about these issues, and had the capacity and the confidence to reach out to try and actually have the best possible advice to go back into the government of the day. I also think with social media, the medium does more than influence the policy message. I think it starts to shape the policy advice itself, which I think is very dangerous in these days. So when you've got a 24-hour uncurated media cycle with social media, political short-termism, you know, has become rampant, and it influences policy choices. So if you're trying to get, you know, a government to think about the structure of regional distribution policies, and your social media feed is throwing up 100 different issues, and the structure of fiscal federalism doesn't show up in any of them, politics and policy interest goes to the immediate. It doesn't necessarily go to the most important. And that's the change, and I think we all should worry about that today. In essence, I think what we have is increasingly a world where governments are focused less on the long term and more on the immediate, less on kind of how we stimulate growth tomorrow and how we do redistribution today. It's more about rights to solutions rather than a responsibility of to find solutions, and he was a market, a small L liberal, and more about messaging and virtue signaling about issues than actually solving things. Tom was always about solving things, not about kind of labels and signaling. So over the last 15 years, I would argue that the demand function from governments, federal and provincial, for analytic economic policy advice has atrophied. And hopefully there will be a revival under Mark Carney. And we will see, because we have lots of issues to do. My final reflection, and I'll move quickly through it, is on the trend across a number of Western countries. This is not a Canadian thing. In many ways, you could argue it's slightly less here than it is in some of our, especially our neighbor to the south, where the voices of economists, and this is really about the economics profession, have become less heard and less influential in public policy circles. And we've had discussions here as well about kind of why and that is happening. And I actually am really struck by, and hopefully you've read it, is the editorial board of the Financial Times in an editorial in mid-2025 asked, and the heading was, how did economists lose traction? Why did they disappear from public discussion on issues? Now, the answer to their own question from the FT was populism. That with populists offering simple, short-term, pain-free alternatives, whether it's subsidies or tariffs or tax cuts or costless deficits and debts, it's harder for the profession, economics, and its language of trade-offs and resource constraints and free markets and long-term to actually be heard. You're actually not aligning with the social media type of The FT also had some criticism of the profession itself, and actually noted that it has been slow to actually accept the world is changing. It's an interesting article or two in the FT, and it talks about we're so beholden to the caterus paribus assumption that, you know, the world is as the world is, and then we'll do a policy shock from it. But actually, in the last 2 decades, the world has been anything but constant. Think of it, geopolitical tensions, tariffs, technological revolutions, financial innovations. We now have state capitalism in both China and the United States. And so our models, the models of economists aren't as reliable as they were because they don't handle structural change as well. And so the degree of relevance is impacted. And economic forecasts have missed a couple of big turning points. The fact that the inflation wasn't transitory after the pandemic is one. The IMF, and I'm almost done, an institution that probably has more economists than any other institution around the world, has also jumped on the issue of relevance. And they commissioned Professor Karen Dian of Harvard, again in 2025, to actually examine why and whether and why economists have lost influence amongst policymakers. She concurs, and she argued that, quote, economists are increasingly sidelined by deepening political polarization and by political leaders who prioritize ideology and expediency over economic analysis. She was writing largely about the United States, but I don't think her remarks are uniquely kind of American-based. She also points to declining public trust in experts and the growing challenges to expert authority from new and often unreliable data sources. Back again to social media and their 1,000 experts. Anybody doing, healthcare these days, your local doctor competes with 1,000 Google doctors, and it's not necessarily a good competition. Fortunately for economists, though, and I think it's interesting, both the FT and the IMF argue that the profession needs, we need the profession, we being policymakers, but the profession has to change. So the FT editorializes that the role of economists speaking out on the costs of poor public policy is more vital than ever in today's world of growing state capitalism, dueling national industrial policies, and fracturing of the international rules-based order. So their bottom line is, got to get more public policy interventions in accessible ways, well communicated, tightly on issues of the public interest. And in Canada, we definitely need to hear more in the public sphere from economists on the significant macroeconomic problems we face. A couple were mentioned, whether it's productivity, the cost of internal trade barriers, trade diversification, what have it. We've got a lot. They're structural, they're long-term, they're exactly what we have tended not to deal with in the last 10 or 15 years because they're hard, they're analytic, they don't have simple answers, but they're absolutely crucial to our future as a country. And that's what I think we have to do. Indeed, I would argue that the demand for new policy ideas, go back to my demand and supply, demand for new policy ideas greatly exceeds the supply today. And that's both an opportunity for the economics profession and a risk if it doesn't take it up. Macroeconomists, and Tom was an example, and others from the Queen's Economics Department have helped shape policy debates in Canada and elsewhere and influence policy decisions by offering clear analysis and well communicated, avoiding elite jargon on trade, tax, growth, inflation, and regulation. And the FT, and I really like this, with both Trump and Brexit clearly top of their mind, wrote in their concluding editorial, the quote, if economists retreat, debates will be dominated by leaders more interested in consolidating power than in sound outcomes. Tom was always interested in sound outcomes. You could debate kind of whether you agreed with that particular one, but his objective was always a sound outcome. Dinan opines that economists have to communicate. It's interesting how often in these analyses communications comes up. And also now, not just talking to policymakers, not just going in to see a minister or a deputy minister, but actually talk to the broader public. Because if public opinion drives political interest, then actually economists, policymakers have got to learn to speak more broadly as well, which comes back to the communications and the other outcomes. Lastly, both the FT and the IMF, and I think this is really important, kind of what they're really calling for today is much more of what Tom Courchene did so well for so long to the benefit of all of us and to public policy in Canada. So thank you, Tom, for your public service.
This down a little bit. It's such a delight to be back here at Queen's, my alma mater, and I'm really delighted to be here to celebrate Tom Courchene. Many thanks to the School of Policy Studies, Keith Banting, who actually hired me 34 years ago. He said I was supposed to be the younger generation. I said, maybe you're stuck in time. It's been a while. So 34 years ago, still the best boss that I have ever had. And really, he asked us to reflect on these two questions that you've heard about. You know, what was Tom's work that made him so effective, and also how is that relevant? Okay, so in the spirit of Tom, I'm going to sort of take some leeway, not really follow directions, and I also might ramble. Yeah, I also might ramble on a little bit, also in the spirit of Tom. But what I hope is that I can take you along a journey where Tom was such an incredible mentor. So I'm going to sort of take a different angle, as Keith said, and really demonstrate why Tom was really a hero to me. So Tom took his incredible intellect, his amazing academic training, and he applied that at the time to contemporary issues, but he was also very forward-looking, right? He was always looking to what might be the next problem. And he would look to different types of policies that could address these in the most efficient way, right? He was mostly about efficiency. But I'm going to come back to that and talk about this equitable side in a moment. And many said that Tom was often hard to follow. Well, I came here and I was doing my master's in economics, and honestly, much of what I heard was Greek to me, right? Lots of letters, alpha, beta, phi, theta. So I was often very confused. And then I took Tom's economics in social policy class. He spoke English, easier to follow, and it was relevant. I could understand, okay, how am I going to apply this? And that really inspired me to do a PhD. I think I can honestly say, had I not taken that class, I probably never would have gone on to that next phase and that next year and applied into the PhD program. So literally, Tom changed my life course. At the time also, I think that he probably, thinking about the rest of the students that came, probably continued to inspire another set of generations across, right? The economic students that walked the halls. I know that he even taught his grandchildren, I think some of which are here today, and probably inspired them, but so many more, so that people could understand that interplay between economics and policy and how one really needs the other. And I hope also that the students that are here today from the MPA program, which I taught economics in, are learning how in policy making, you need to take that economic piece and then translate it back to the policy so that there's this multi-dimensional and multi-two-way path. So next on my path, Tom served as one of my PhD advisors, along one of my other wonderful mentors, Charlie Beach, who's here today. But Tom provided also not just mentorship in terms of my dissertation, which was on female labor supply and childcare costs, but more importantly on how to think. Right? That is the best gift that you can give people, because you're going to have to take that. At the time you're doing your PhD, you think that's the most important thing. How am I going to get through this? Well, then you've got to get on and do the rest of your career. So how are you actually going to think and apply what you've learned for the rest of your career? So I think there were 4 pretty significant lessons. One of them was Tom's mantra about skating to where the puck is going to be. So when you're trying to think of your research agenda, don't just think about the obvious. And let me give you an example. A lot of my work after I transitioned out of labor economics into health economics, I've been looking at how can we use economic tools to improve well-being and reduce non-communicable diseases. And one way is through taxation, right? We're pretty familiar with this. Tobacco taxes, it's a simple theory, reduce demand. So sugary beverage taxes can reduce the demand, right, for consumption in the same idea. Sugary beverages contribute 50% of added sugar intake in the diet of most North Americans. We've got type 2 diabetes, we have cardiovascular disease, hypertension, major problems, and we know that healthcare costs from a policy point of view are constantly competing with the budget, right? We know that most countries are spending 10% of their GDP at least on healthcare. So many evaluations of these taxes would simply estimate models of demand. Well, how price sensitive is it? Well, we know the demand curve slopes downward, so there's hundreds of papers on that. But unintended consequences, that's what down the road is where people are going to ask questions. Well, what's the impact, say, on employment? When you're trying to move these policies forward, you have to fight industry. And industry, the beverage industry does not want that tax, just the same way that the tobacco industry didn't. So they're going to be out there in full force claiming massive job loss. There are only 4 studies worldwide that have looked at employment impacts. And so this is something with my team that I said, okay, let's try to look at this, because this is one of these unintended consequences of where the puck is going to be, because we are going to have answers for policymakers when they're trying to get these policies through, and industry comes and says there's going to be job loss. They need a study, a rigorous study that they can say, no, there is no job loss. When there's a tax, if people don't consume sugary beverages, they're actually going to spend that money on something else, and that money is still part of the economy. So you have to sort of be anticipating what is going to be the sort of that next piece of evidence that policymakers might need. Another piece of role modeling that Tom did for me, and I saw this sort of firsthand from the beginning, was his work in terms of working across disciplines, right? So I think, we've had some discussion about things that economists do, and I think as economists, often we're sort of, in our lane. And then when I moved into public health, I sort of took that application and worked with a number of different, physicians, lawyers, folks in public health, and nutritionists, so that you can start to answer more complex questions. I think the more diversity in terms of the academy that you bring in, that really opens up your mind. And I think and including, I've worked with a lot of political scientists. I think that was an area, and I think, Keith worked a lot with, Tom worked a lot with Keith to really broaden one's sets of questions, because that leads you to more comprehensive answers. And I think that's also part of, what the future needs is thinking about economists. And I think one of the points that Kevin raised is thinking about the fact that they need to be more integrated. So we need economists working with other disciplines, and then other disciplines pulling economists into the layman's discussions. My other point, which also reflects something said, is that we know that economists don't communicate very well and don't disseminate. So Tom showed us as a role model, and particularly for me, how to do that. Start by speaking in English or French. Don't speak in Greek, because the rest of society is going to have a hard time, right, interpreting the evidence. So leave the econometrics out of it, leave the models out, and explain the implications in a clear and actionable way. Otherwise, policymakers can't actually do anything with that. And take the research papers and really disseminate them down. Sort of write the academic paper that you publish in a journal, but then write a policy brief about the academic paper, because the policymakers they don't have the time to wade through all of that. So really try to sort of get your message across. And that's something that I really learned from Tom and try to practice quite a bit. Also, Tom taught everybody to think outside the box. And in my personal sort of taking in of that, I call that now think the impossible. And we are, in some sense, in a time now where it's impossible, it feels like sometimes, to get policies through. So, for example, the taxes on sugary beverage I was talking about. Industry is so powerful that they really have an influence on whether policies are making it through their lobbying, right? But if you just retreat and you don't actually produce the evidence on that, you're just not going to make it. And sometimes you think, okay, I'm going to give up. Maybe I'm going to start working in a different field. But that's the only way you're eventually going to get there. That's the only way, right, that and economists working with other policymakers that really helped tobacco taxation, because that's really, right, the French economists, it's a Pigouvian tax. You're internalizing, right, those externalities. So we need economists constantly pushing the forefront on these policies. And again, maybe it's repetition. You just keep at it. It took 35 years after the Surgeon General really started talking about how tobacco kills for us finally to have commonplace, right? No one thinks anything about having clean indoor air laws now or having tobacco taxes. So we need to get there in these other ways as well. I know much of Tom's work, or a lot of it, it covered monetary policy. So I'm originally a labor economist, public finance person who moved into health economics and worked a lot in social policy areas. So to me, I'm going to reflect a little bit more on his contributions to human capital. Tom always seemed to be returning to this topic, and I think he just really recognized that the investment and the importance in human capital is a way that we can really help people move forward. You can't be a productive participant in the economy. You're kind of shut out, right, if you don't have access to human capital. And he also recognized the fact that if we don't invest in human capital, right, that takes funds. There's also trade-offs, right? We were thinking about how are we going to make the economy more productive. There can also be issues around consumption costs, right, related to healthcare. And provincial governments are often trading these off. Well, am I going to spend more money on healthcare? Am I going to invest in human capital? So what's the difference between a policy that actually is an investment that's going to have a longer-term return versus consumption, right, in the present? And I think human beings are just generally not very good at discounting the future and trying to take this into consideration and understanding the importance of investment. Tom also talked a lot, or in his writings, he really reflected on the interplay between the impact of investing in human capital and inequality. And I think you have to look no further than the US to really understand that impact. And I think actually from a personal point of view where I live, you have to look no further than the neighborhoods of Chicago where I live. You have a square block and kitty corner, and you've got excellent schools, and on the next block you have terrible schools. And it is a heartbreaking situation. It's not even about, we think about provincial equalization and how that can help have, right, the basis premise, but there's even local level. And so if there is not this investment, right, at every step of the way, not just the post-secondary issues, but right down from the moment that a child is entering into preschool, primary school, secondary school, many issues are not even that folks are just not even getting to the post-secondary education. So if you shut out different groups and you have policies that are not addressing pressing issues, you will have inequality that really stems right over time and persists for decades. And I think that these are some of the differences where if you don't have policymakers constantly sort of trying to bring these pieces to the forefront, as we've had in Canada about investment in human capital, it's going to be particularly problematic. And then you will end up in a situation where you're going to have other policy issues. And for example, in the US, where there may be a lack of investment in human capital, but the costs down the road, the thinking about that, there's much more spent, for example, on the carceral state, for example, which was another major issue, one which that Tom did not get into, though, I will say. So why is, our Tom's, some of Tom's approaches also particularly relevant? Well, also, he understood about not developing social policy in a vacuum, but thinking about, again, what is the interplay across the different policies and how will they impact people? And if you're thinking, for example, about a negative income tax, what is the rate at which there might be a clawback? How is that going to interplay with welfare? How is that going to be impacted with child benefits systems, UI, thinking about how do we create a system where we can redistribute but not have dependency, so that one is always better off by working more and being more efficient. But in the case where you need it, you have a social safety net on which you can fall back on. And in developing social welfare programs, we know that there's a lot of distinct ideas and cultural ideas across the country. And Tom really argued how Canada can successfully maintain its dual language, multiculturalism, and identity, allowing, for example, having Quebec may develop different policies based on a different legal system, but at the same time, other provinces could develop their policies or cede some of those policy responsibilities back up to the federal level, right from one level to another if they so wished. And I think this is particularly important in today's world, where we see many countries many jurisdictions really trying to erase different cultural identities instead of trying to embrace them and understand how they can lead to a richer environment that best suits the needs of different peoples across the country. And it was really a privilege of mine to work with Tom on his book called A First Nations Province. That was a moment, I think, also of mentorship where Tom, I was working on that, gathering data, working together, and he said, well, let's do this together. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts, right? You can give to a student who's working and bring them in. And for me, I was, as you can imagine, that was, I think, about 35 years ago. I was beyond ecstatic. I'm like, absolutely, Lemma, I'm right there. I'll go and, I was in the basements in Ottawa before the digital age of gathering data, various libraries across that city. And his idea with that book was providing provincial status to Indigenous peoples through the idea of them having the laws surrounding that they would have access to equalization, so the fiscal capacity to develop programs, but then also the rights to develop programs so that they could determine education and health programs and deliver programs that would actually be most suited to the needs of a certain population. And so he provided in that there's a framework and an infrastructure for self-determination and the capacity to do so, so that there could be this set of culturally appropriate policies for people to thrive and grow. So when I was growing up around the dinner time table, my father actually, who coincidentally also happened to be an economist like Tom and also taught me a lot, told me that social policy should be developed using what's called the helicopter test. And I kind of looked up and said, okay, the helicopter test. So he said, assume you were born and you're going to be dropped from a helicopter and you have no idea where you are going to land. So given that, what would you like the social policy landscape to look like? And Tom's legacy, an incredible body of work, I think really helped to make sure that Canada passed the helicopter test. He contributed, he aimed to have an efficient set of policies across the country, so redistribution, but efficiency and not dependency. He wanted to have, no matter where you lived across the country, including if you came from Waukesha, Saskatchewan, whether you were born into a rich or poor family, whether you spoke English or French, whether you were an Indigenous person, whether you were an immigrant, that you would pass the test, or this country would pass the test with increasing success. And I think his policies really helped to do that because he thought about provincial equity without dependency, cultural equity, health equity, equity and access to human capital, income equity around the negative income tax, all of which at the same time he was working in other fields, right, based on an efficient fiscal and monetary system. To me, Tom was brilliant and a giant in his field, but at the same time, what I saw day to day as one of Tom's mentees, as a master's student first, then as a PhD student, and then as a junior colleague of Tom's in the School of Policy Study, was that Tom had an incredible moral compass. And that is so relevant for today. We need more and more people who are out there informing policy with that moral compass. He was humble, fair and equitable, always willing to take risks. He believed in people, and I was lucky enough to be one of those people. And he was incredibly generous, including with his time. Brilliant people with these important qualities are so needed and relevant. To me, it was that brilliance in combination with those traits that permeated and guided his collaborations, which made him one of Canada's most impactful contributors to advancing meaningful economic and social policy. I'm forever grateful and so privileged to have benefited from Tom's mentorship that started 36 years ago. It's been a long time, and I hope and I feel that I try to emulate that with my students. It's no surprise, having been mentored by Tom, that for the last 3 decades, I've pursued a career that bridges economics and social policy. We know for Tom that Margie inspired and contributed so much to his work, and so we have a lot to thank her for as well. And I'm so grateful to have been able to know Margie this whole time. Thank you, Tom and Margie. May you rest in peace, Tom.
Okay, well, that's a commendation, and it's a nice place to pull this session to a close. So I'd like to thank our three panelists for getting us off to such a wonderful start. And now for lunch. Lunch is served where the coffee was, if you found the coffee.
We just have one more. It is a tradition as part of the School of Policy Studies.
Oh, I'm sorry.
To have a student say thank you. So, no, I know everyone's getting hungry, but hold your horses for one more.
As Hannah said, it is tradition for a student to thank the speakers who so graciously come to speak to us. And so first, Professor Banting, every time we hear from you, we learn something new. So thank you for that. And to the panelists, Dr. Lynch, Professor Boadway, and Dr. Powell, you are all experts in your field and leaders, and you brought a unique perspective to this conversation. Today's celebration of life is timely, as economic policy is becoming the focus of many Canadians and therefore policymakers alike. We appreciate learning from your expertise on this subject matter now more than ever. So on behalf of the MPA class of 2026, thank you for joining us in celebrating Dr. Courchene and the contributions he made to public policy. And thank you for continuing his tradition of sharing those contributions with future generations of policymakers.